It's a wonderful turnout. We have people here from various parts of the country, a lot of different parts of the country. We even have an old friend of mine called Hein Superior, who's come from a place where he could watch the war against the ISIS people or their sister organizations right on the Golan, right on the Ramat Golan, and he's also with us this evening. And a lot of people come to hear Martin Sherman talk about rethinking Palestine, or what would Sherlock Holmes have said. You remember the Three Stooges? Can everybody hear me? Everybody can hear me. Oh, good that you tell me. Now can you hear me? Yes. Okay. You remember the Three Stooges of the Marx Brothers? No? Those of you from England probably remember the Goon Show. Yeah. You all remember Monty Python. Well, even the wacky scriptwriters of these loony comedy shows couldn't have thought up the absurd scenarios that we see nowadays about Israel. Well, throughout the Middle East and in other regions, hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, are being slaughtered in insane civil wars, or dying of starvation. Millions are left homeless. Unspeakably horrendous atrocities. Well, nuclear proliferation becoming a ghastly possibility. And yes, some of this does make the headlines from time to time and arouse global attention, but after a while, people's attention moves to other supposedly more pressing matters, such as when plans for a housing project in Jerusalem are reported. Now that's interesting, because 100 years ago, Jews were building houses in Jerusalem. 2,000 years ago? 3,000 years ago, Jews were building houses in Jerusalem, but today, this is something that really has the media, the world leaders, and other enlightened souls quite agitated and scrambling self-righteously to voice concerns, censure, and condemnation. And yet, when a murderous terrorist army launches dozens of rockets into Israeli towns and villages on a daily basis and for a prolonged period, these same media and the leaders, world leaders, and the enlightened souls choose to ignore all this. More or less, they ignore it more or less until Israel starts doing what any other nation would do. When Israel tries to stop these attacks, while making unheard of efforts to, not just to minimize, but to avoid civilian casualties, or rather casualties of the enemy's civilians, who are always used as human shields for propaganda purposes. Wow, even Satan would blush at this. When Israel tries to stop these murderous attacks, well, there's that self-righteous scramble again. The media, the world leaders, and the enlightened ones, and in streets around the world, massive angry demonstrations and calls for boycott and other punitive actions against Israel. It's a pattern that keeps repeating itself. We've seen this over and over again. And then, of course, there's the perennial demand that Israel get out of all the territory that it brutally and illegally stole from its apparently peace-loving neighbors. Never mind that for generations Israel has been repeatedly attacked and even invaded with the purpose of destroying it. Never mind that the land that Israel is told to get out of is actually it's actually been ratified and legitimized as the homeland for the Jewish people by the League of Nations. And never mind that the United Nations is actually bound by this through its own charter. But poof, reminds us of someone. Poof, all forgotten. When it comes to Israel, international agreements are dismissed as irrelevant and simply ignored or mendaciously modified. There's a common denominator behind all this. It's the same common denominator behind most of the serious problems in the world, including the existential ones. It's dishonesty, deceitfulness, the use of falsehood in its many different forms, half-truths, double-speak. How did Orwell know about double-speak 60 years ago when he wrote about it? Yeah? Double-speak? Well, with Israel, it's very applicable. Double standards, the blind denial, no matter what, crude assumptions posing as fact, the cynical disregard for relevant facts and blatant lies. We can see the whole range of mendacity eagerly practiced against Israel by much of humanity. I can imagine Goebbels. I can imagine Goebbels quivering and squealing in erotic ecstasy if you could only see all this. That's how absurd scene it all is. Now, this evening, Martin Sherman is going to discuss Israel's future regarding Judea and Samaria, which is also known by its de-Judaized term, the West Bank, and maybe some of you only know it as the West Bank. One state or two states, how to cope with the demographic problems. The thing is, this is a highly charged political issue, and we have to bear in mind that whenever anything with a political connection is discussed, objectivity and rational thinking are often shunted aside in favor of our own personal political preferences. And we need to be aware of the pitfalls, the cognitive pitfalls that can easily creep into any political discourse, or the ways that we tend to obscure, ignore, or distort facts if they don't conform to our personal or political sentiments and allegiances. Or conversely, when we automatically believe something even though it's far-fetched or outdated or convincingly repudiated, simply because it does match our political sentiments and allegiances. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having political sentiments and allegiances, but we should always keep our eyes on the road. It's important to bear all this in mind when we listen to what Martin Sherman has to say. Don't agree or disagree with him only on the basis of your political or ideological inclinations. If you agree, do so because what he says does seem intrinsically to conform to fact, logic, empiric wisdom, and feasibility. And conversely, if you disagree, do so because what Martin says does not, as far as you can honestly tell, it does not conform to fact, logic, and empiric wisdom and feasibility. Consider whether what he says is rational and accurate or not, and whether he takes all the relevant factors into consideration. or remain unconvinced, one way or the other. Perhaps temporarily, because you might need more time to think about it. But please try and be honest about the conclusions you come to. Now, Martin Sherman has had a long career in figuring out what's what in Israel and our relationship with our neighbors and with the rest of the world. He has a doctorate in political science and international relations. He was a lecturer for 20 years at Tel Aviv University. He served in an operational capacity in Israel's defense establishment. He was a ministerial advisor in Yitzhak Shamir's government. Whew. And there's more. There's a lot more, yeah? But I'm going to, before I ask Martin to come and talk, I'm going to ask Martin's program manager, Director of Operations, to say a few words.
Welcome and good evening. Can you all hear me? I will be short. I am the Director of Operations for the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies.
What's your name?
Malcolm Dash. Dr. Sherman is the founder and executive director of the Institute. And as you all know, he is a leading political scientist who's devoted over 30 years to the study and the research of the Jewish-Arab conflict, and in particular, the Israel-Palestinian struggle. There are very few political thinkers of originality in Israel today. However, Dr. Sherman is definitely one of them. He is an intellectual warrior, even a giant, who advances the Zionistic principles of the founding pioneers of the Jewish Zionist enterprise. And he doesn't stop at the portals of rigorous analysis. He, as opposed to many other political analysts, furnishes credible and feasible solutions. At every opportunity, Martin has engaged the post-Zionist elites via his Jerusalem Post columns, TV, and many other media outlets and debate forums. He courageously, I would say fearlessly, disputes with these sacred cows, the elites of Israeli society, who hold our system politically to hostage. Dr. Sherman is all about changing the national discourse from the Oslo paradigm to a humanitarian resolution of the dispute. The Oslo Accords, a two-state solution, has demonstrably not worked. Indeed, it has exposed Israel to strategically grave threats. Dr. Sherman will provide us with a consummate analysis of why and how the two-state solution can't be the working assumption for an Israeli government policy. His presentation of what would Sherlock Holmes have said is a clear and masterful reductionism of why a two-state concept is a recipe for disaster for the Jewish state. There may be some amongst you who identify with the objectives of our institute, and we would welcome your participation as volunteers or financial supporters. Please welcome Dr. Sherman.
Thank you. After such an introduction, I should put glass down my head and go home. Can you hear me without the microphone? Well, what I was saying is after such introductions, I should put glass down my head and go home. Well, thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here. And we appreciate the effort that you've made to come listen to what I have to say. I apologize for being late, but it was Lieberman's fault. They blocked off the road outside the Ministry of Finance, and there was a huge blockage there, so I came a bit late, and I apologize. I probably need to apologize for something else. The presentation you're about to see is a little long. I know it's a little long, but I always have to decide whether I should come down the side of educating or entertaining. And I tend to move towards educating rather than entertaining, so it might be just a little bit too long. But I think the information and ideas that there are on the presentation are important, and I think it's a valuable contribution, with all due modesty, to the debate. One of the most withering criticisms that what's called the left wing, I don't really like the term left and right, I prefer doves and hawks, but let's just keep to the usual terminology. One of the most withering criticisms that the left wing have of the right wing is what's your alternative? Up until recently, that's been a valid criticism because there haven't been many counter proposals of what to do on the right. In the last year or two, the right wing has been coming up with some proposals. Unfortunately, I think many of the proposals that have been put forward by the right wing today are probably, if anything, more dangerous and more detrimental than the two-state solution. And I'll say something about that a little later. Obviously, what I'm going to show you here cuts across the grain of political correctness, but I believe that it adheres very strictly to factual correctness. I think I'm part of that vanishing breed of people who still define themselves as an Israeli patriot, but I really do believe in the intrinsic justice and necessity of Zionism and the resurrection and preservation of Jewish political self-determination. But I don't think that undermines my ability to function as a professional political scientist. And I'm one of the few people who think that political science is not an oxymoron. And I think that the conclusions and the analysis which lead to that conclusion that you'll see are the result or flow from a rather rigorous application of the principles of political science and international principles to the conflict. Perhaps the only arbitrary point that I have in this presentation is my point of departure that Israel should be the nation state of the Jewish people. Because if you're prepared to forego that point of departure, many other things might be possible. But if your point of departure is that Israel should continue to be the nation state of the Jewish people, I dare to say that what I'm going to suggest is the only solution. Now, as I say, I'm going to take issue with conventional wisdom, and which is basically based on cultural truisms rather than scientific truths. But you'll see that throughout the presentation I don't quote any traditional right-wing sources, only left-wing and Arab sources, and all I do is connect the dots. Well, with that rather long-winded introduction, let me begin. I suppose there are quite a few people here who know who said this. In talking about the permanent solution with the Palestinian, that the Palestinians should have an entity which is less than a state. In other words, denying or rejecting the two-state solution. And what the permanent solution should entail is a united Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty, including Ma'ale Adumim, Givat Ze'ev. The security border should be the Jordan Valley in the broadest meaning of that term. And the changes will include the inclusion of Gush Etzion, Efrat and Beitar within Israeli sovereignty, and the establishment of blocks of settlements in Judea and Samaria, note the terminology, Judea and Samaria, like Gush Katif. How many people know who said that? And when? How many people?
Rabin?
Who says Rabin? Well, actually, it's interesting because this is a politically engaged audience, and very few people know who it really was. And it was Rabin. But when did he say it?
Right before he was assassinated.
Yeah. The important thing is that this was part of Rabin's last address in the Knesset when he was requesting parliamentary approval of the Oslo agreements. In other words, this is what the Israeli public was sold as to what Oslo meant. Now, if Bibi Netanyahu were to embrace this word for word today, he would be dismissed as an unreasonable extremist, which just shows you how dangerously eroded Israeli positions have been. After he won the Nobel Peace Prize, October the 5th, 1995, in other words, 2 years after Oslo and 1 month before he was assassinated. Now, the point of departure, the logical point of departure for this presentation is the following quotation from the Sign of the Four. When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, let's start off by identifying what we will identify as impossible. First of all, we must identify what is impossible in terms of Israeli security. The next thing we have to identify is what is impossible in terms of the political aspirations and competence of the Palestinians. And once we've done that, we can start exploring the improbable. In other words, we need to know what Israel cannot do, what Israel should not do, and what Israel must do. So let's start off with identifying the impossible in terms of Israel's security constraints. Here is a prophecy made, must be now over 3 decades ago, by someone who warned what would happen if Israel embraced the policy that has embraced since Oslo. The establishment of such a Palestinian state means the inflow of combat-ready Palestinian forces, more than 25,000 men under arms, into Judea and Samaria. Again, notice the terminology, Judea and Samaria. This force, together with the local youth, will double itself in a short space of time. And more or less completely accurate in terms of his numerical estimations. It will not be short of weapons or any other military equipment, and in a short space of time, an infrastructure for waging of war will be set up in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. Okay, and we've seen that happen. Israel will have problems in preserving day-to-day security, which may drive the country into war, as it has done 3 or 4 times already, or undermine the morale of its citizens. In times of war, the frontier of the Palestinian state will constitute an excellent staging point for mobile forces to mount attacks on infrastructure installations vital for Israel's existence, to impede the freedom of action of the Israeli Air Force in the skies over Israel, and to cause bloodshed among the population in areas adjacent to the frontier line. And of course, this has now become dramatically more relevant with the ascendancy of ISIS. But who knows who said this?
Harris. Can we have a vote?
Well, I think no more remarkable than the accuracy of the prophecy is the identity of the prophet. Because it was Shimon Peres. You should all try to, there's a book out called Tomorrow Is Now. Unfortunately, it's only in Hebrew, called Ke'et Machar, which Shimon Peres wrote in 1977-78 after the Labour Party was first deposed or lost power. It was based on an article that he wrote in the Davar newspaper. Remember, there used to be a newspaper called Davar? And there was one of the leading journalists was Khadai Eshet. Khadai Eshet together with Shimon Peres wrote this article, but that later turned into a book, which was Shimon Peres' programmatic presentation of what should be done in the country. And you'll see a few other quotations from that. You can see Shimon Peres tomorrow is now Jerusalem, Ketel 1978. Anyway, as Sherlock Holmes goes about looking for clues as to what should be done, what is the solution, one of the most important findings, I think, would be this map. Now, how many people know about this map? Yeah, I know you know. But notice how few people know about the existence of this map. Notice it's marked secret. Sorry? It's marked secret, stamped by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl Wheeler, and this was a map prepared by the US Joint Chiefs of Staff for the President of the United States to designate what are the most vital areas for Israel's security by the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. And as you can see, almost the entire area of Judea and Samaria, certainly in the highlands, the Golan, the Gaza Strip, and parts of Sinai, including the approaches to the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, the fact that so few people know about that, Ralph was talking about before that we're being attacked in the world. My take on that is that much of that is a dereliction of duty of the Israeli officialdom. Because the fact that so few people who are involved in politics, who are politically engaged, don't know about the existence of this map, can only be blamed on the Israeli government. Because who's supposed to tell you? Who's supposed to tell you that this is what the American Joint Chiefs of Staff said was essential for Israeli security? Who's supposed to tell you? Now, sorry? Why is it in America's interest? You don't think that we should, forget about the Israeli left. This is what the Israeli right should be using to demolish the left-wing arguments.
Why isn't the Jordan Valley?
When was this?
I don't know. This was in '67, but there have been other maps since then. But in '67 it was presented to Johnson, to Lyndon Johnson. Sorry? Yeah, sure. This is a quote from an article written by Eugene Rostow. Eugene Rostow, among other things, was the dean of the law faculty at Yale University. But what's relevant for the discussion here is that he was the Undersecretary of State and the senior American diplomat involved in the formulation of Resolution 242, who really knew what was behind the formulation of that document. And he wrote this article, which was published in 1993, the year that the Oslo agreements were signed. And he takes up an argument with two senators. Can you see the screen? Yes. What these two senators, Byrd and Dole, somehow assume is that somehow or other, some Arab state has the right to claim that anything beyond the Green Line is Arab territory under 242 and 338. And he says something very important. This is exactly contrary to the purposes and the provisions. Okay, so the fact that any territory across the Green Line is up for grabs for some Arab country is against what the Americans had in mind when they formulated 242. There's an important document which has now been released. It is useful in interpreting the Resolution 242 because it reveals part of what the American government had in mind in pushing the resolution through. There's a map of the area showing the place as a particular security concern to Israel. This map was prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who made a study of Israel's security to advise the President on what security concerns of Israel were. And you can see, I'll come back to that in a minute. The study advised that the security of Israel required Israel to receive part of the territory in the West Bank as essential to its defense. In fact, all the studies of the Israeli security problem reached the same conclusion. From the security point of view, Israel must hold the high points in the West Bank and the areas along the Jordan River. I do not know, he wrote this in 1993. I do not know if the Joint Chiefs of Staff would draw a different map today, but I doubt it very much. And that Eugene Rostow, the peacemaking process in the UN Resolution 242-338, Israel's legitimacy in law and history, and that you can't see because the screen's a bit short, but that was published in 1993, the same year that the Oslo agreements were signed.
Can you just explain what are on that map? What are the gray areas? And
The gray areas are the areas that are across the green line, which the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff considered vital for Israel's security.
Right, but not the Jordan Valley?
They excluded this part here. Okay. Now, I'm not sure this is what's superfluous for this crowd, for this audience, but let's go through this quickly. Just comparing Greater Israel with other countries, it's always interesting to get a sense of proportion. And if you compare Israel to the Muslim world, you can see how insignificant it is. And if you compare it to the Arab world, again, you can see how perverse the formula of land for peace is. Because it assumes that you can get peace by giving the Arabs what they already have a huge amount of, i.e. land, and get in exchange from them what they have very little of, i.e. peace. Okay, so, but it's not only geographic expanse, it's also topographical structure that makes this area so important. Okay, if you see here, you have the area designated for the Palestinian state is actually a block of limestone mountains which rise from the heavily populated coastal plain, and you can see the distances here, 4 miles to Petah Tikva, 4 miles to Ben Gurion Airport, 10 miles to Kiryat Gat, and we've all had a very tangible demonstration of what these distances mean in the last operation in Gaza. In cross-section it looks like that. This is the Jordan Valley, which of course is one of the best natural anti-tank trenches with a 1,000 kilometer differential here. Here you have the Green Line, Ben Gurion Airport, the Greater Tel Aviv area, and the waterline. Clearly, anyone who controls the highland controls both the approaches to the east and the entire coastal plain here. Now, what would a Palestinian intelligence officer see from those heights in his binoculars? Okay? Let's suppose the intelligence officer was standing here, which is the site of Homesh, the settlement or community destroyed by Arik Sharon in 2005, because you remember that the unilateral withdrawal was not just from Gaza, but it was from it was from northern Samaria as well. So this intelligence officer, through his binoculars, would see this. You know what that is? That's the power station in Caesarea. That's what it looks like at sunset. Now let's suppose the intelligence officer took his binoculars and moved south to here. Okay? What will he see from this point? There you have the terminal at Ben Gurion Airport, and the main runway. There you have a plane on the runway. All the city's binoculars. There you can see the plane again. This, by the way, was taken by my son-in-law with a civilian camera. Here you have the long passage that you walk down from passport control to the duty free. Okay, you can almost see the labels on the whiskey bottle.
What is the distance, Martin? What's the distance from where your intelligence officer is?
Well, it depends exactly where he is, but if you go back, let me show you. If you look at this here, you can see these buildings. Or even here, let me go back one more. Look here, you see? These buildings here are the buildings inside a village called Rantis. So this is taken east of Rantis. So you're quite deep inside the territory, right? It's about 13 kilometers in a straight line, but
to the airport, it's a few hundred yards.
no, from the airport it's a few kilometers, but it's easily within mortar range, especially given the elevation difference. But this is a Palestinian village. So you can see it's taken from behind there. There you have the Azrieli Towers. There you have the Aviv Tower in the Diamond Exchange area. And that was Wood Barak's old apartment. So you actually had a line of sight from inside Palestine almost into the windows of the defense minister's apartment. And there you have the reading. Here again you can see this is taken from well inside the area. You know, all this would still be inside the Palestinian state. Yeah. This is taken east of this village. There you have the reading power station. Here you have Tel Aviv University about here. And then again, the Kirov Towers. Okay, so the strange thing about this is that everybody knew about it, and everybody objected to it. For instance, if you go back to Shimon Peres, he wrote, even if the Palestinians agree that their state have no army or weapons, who can guarantee that a Palestinian army would not be mustered later to encamp at the gates of Jerusalem and the approaches of the lowlands? And if the Palestinian state were unarmed, how would it block the terrorist acts perpetrated by extremist fundamentalists or irredentists? Now note, that was in his book, The New Middle East, the same year that Oslo was agreed. Okay, and this is a very good question, especially today. If you think of Sinai, okay, Sinai is being demilitarized. Who is going to deal with the jihadis there? And it's only a matter of time until the Egyptians demand remilitarization. And the more weapons they move into Sinai, the more weapons are going to fall into the hands of the jihadis, just as they did with ISIS in Iraq. So there you can see the approach to the lowlands.
What was Peres's response when he's presented with?
Well, actually, I wrote an article about this. It's called Peres versus Peres in the Jerusalem Post, and he wrote a very unfocused and, in my opinion, completely irrelevant response. He's got no response to it.
No, but he's got it now, isn't he?
Well, I think that's been the case for a long time.
So can we keep on policy and not on personality, please?
Sorry?
This is most unfair to speak like that about a person.
Why?
Why? Because you're talking about several years ago. You're not talking about him at the moment.
You know, why don't we leave the comments and the questions till the end of the presentation?
Okay.
Have it open for
Further,
questions.
he's going back to his book. Tomorrow is now. It is of course doubtful whether territorial expanse can provide absolute deterrence. However, the lack of minimal territorial expanse places a country in a position of a total lack of deterrence. This in itself constitutes almost compulsive temptation to attack Israel from all directions. In the 20th century, with the development of rapid mobility of armies, the defensive importance of territorial expanse has increased. Okay? Because the increased range, the increased fire capacity, and the increased mobility of modern weaponry makes territory more important. Before, in the olden days, you could stop the advance of an army with a castle. You can't do that today. You need more territory to deploy your forces. You need more territory for maneuvering with them. So, in modern warfare, the greater fire, the firepower, the mobility, and the range of modern weaponry has made territory even more important. And by the way, in the war, what was it called? What did they call the war against Kuwait with American forces? Desert Storm. The American deployment was the width. I'm not talking about the front. The width of the deployment of the American forces was 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers. And let's suppose the Israelis are 3 times smarter than Americans. Okay, they only need 30 kilometers to deploy. Take the Green Line, 30 kilometers in, what's left for a Palestinian state? In the 20th century, with the development of rapid mobility of armies, the defensive importance of territorial expanse has increased. Without a border which affords security, a country is doomed to destruction in war. In 1948, it may have been possible to defend the thin waste of Israel, the most populated area, when the most formidable weapon used by both sides was the cannon of limited mobility and limited firepower. There you can see limited mobility and limited firepower. In other words, territory was less important. If a Palestinian state is established, it will be armed to the teeth, and we've seen that. Within it, there will be bases of the most extreme terrorist forces, who will be equipped with anti-tank and anti-aircraft shoulder-launched rockets, which will endanger not only random passers-by, but every airplane and every helicopter taking off in the skies of Israel, and every vehicle traveling along the major traffic routes in the coastal plain. Now just imagine the Palestinian state and Highway 6. Okay, in the last war, we saw the significance of a 50-kilometer border abutting our sparsely populated rural south. Now imagine a 500-kilometer border abutting the heavily populated urban center with the airport within mortar range. And we saw that the Iron Dome wasn't very effective against mortars. Okay? That is the inescapable prospect of a Palestinian state. And even Amnon Rubinstein. Remember Amnon Rubinstein was Meretz?
Yeah.
And he won the Israel Prize for law. The proponents of a Palestinian state claim that if they, the Arabs, threaten us with artillery from Qalqilia, we will threaten Qalqilia with our artillery. However, the answer to this is very simple. The Arab world can exist, prosper, and develop not only if our artillery threatens Qalqilia, but even if it hits it. Israel, small and exposed, will neither be able to exist nor prosper if its urban centers, its vulnerable airport, and its narrow winding roads are shelled. There you can see its vulnerable airport. This is the fundamental difference between them and us. This is the terrible danger involved in the establishment of a third independent sovereign state between us and the Jordan Valley. The third state is liable to be an arrowhead directed at the very heart of Israel, with all the force of the Arab world behind it. Okay, Amnon Rubinstein in Haaretz. Now, I don't know if any of you are members of any political party, but if you do, you should really find out why your political party isn't distributing this stuff.
What year was this?
This was in 1976. He wrote 2 articles, one after the other. The one was the pitfall of a third Palestinian state, and the other one was Palestinian lies. One week after the other. Okay? This was just a year before he entered the Knesset. Then it wasn't Meretz, it was Shinui elected to him. And this kind of asymmetry.
No, it was Glassman.
Right?
Was that? Was it?
Right, yeah.
This thing called rats.
No,
76 was Dutch.
it was Dutch.
Dutch, she knew it grew out of Dutch. Yeah. She knew out of Dutch and then she knew he joined Meretz. Dutch didn't join Meretz, she knew he joined Meretz. Anyway, you have Yigal Allon, the iconic Labour moderate, head of the Palmach, deputy prime minister, and he talks about the asymmetry of the conflict and the importance of territory in war, in modern warfare. The innovation and sophistication in weaponry, including the appearance of ground-to-ground missiles and supersonic fighter bombers, not only fail to diminish the value of strategic depth and natural barriers, but in fact enhance their importance. This is even more true in Israel's difficult geographic position. Okay, so modern weaponry increases the importance of territory. One does not have to be a military expert to easily identify the critical defects of the armistice lines that existed until June the 4th, 1967. For Israel, and this is the crux, for Israel, a military defeat would mean physical distinction of a large part of its population and the political elimination of the Jewish state. To lose a single war is to lose everything. And that's the asymmetry of the situation. We cannot afford to lose a single war, and so if you're going to err on the side of caution.
What's the year for that? 76.
This is written in 76, by the way, in Foreign Affairs, which is a very prestigious journal. Okay, now what are the elements of the Israeli defense doctrine? If you look on most analysis of the Israeli defense doctrine, you will find the following three elements: deterrence, early warning, and victory. In Hebrew it sounds a lot better. Okay, in other words, you're supposed to deter the enemy. If your deterrence is going to fail, you need early warning with your intelligence. And then what you need to do is preempt and attack before the aggression takes place on your own territory. But this is an oversimplification, because what do you need for early warning? First of all, you need to collect the intelligence, hopefully correctly. Then you need to assess the intelligence, hopefully accurately. And then you need to draw the conclusions, again, hopefully accurately. Now, this is not an instantaneous process. Remember the distances for surprise, okay? So, and then, of course, once you've drawn the conclusion, once you've drawn the conclusions, you have to decide what you're going to do with those conclusions you've drawn. Like, are you going to bomb Iraq or not? Even if you have the intelligence and the correct intelligence. So our simple diagram before becomes a little more complicated. Okay, so you have your deterrence. If deterrence fails, you get an early warning. But your early warning means you have to go through all these processes. Now, that means you need, if you're going to be surprised, you need to stop the attack somewhere. Okay, now remember, even today, much of Israel's military force is based on reserves. Okay, you need enough time to call up your reserves, equip them with weapons, convert them from civilians to warriors, and that doesn't take again, that's not instantaneous. That takes a good number of time, a good number of hours. The sort of best case scenario of 48, probably if the country is under rocket attack, missile attack, it'll probably take longer for all sorts of reasons. There'll be traffic stoppages. Reservists will first of all take their family out of the heavily populated areas to some rural area and then go to the army base. So you need, instead of taking 48 hours, it may take 120 hours. That means your regular troops, young kids of 18 with thin shirts against probably superior forces, need the best possible positions. So where do you want them? On the hilltop looking down, or on the bottom of the plain with the enemy above them? Okay? By the way, I lectured for a year at one of the colleges in Akko. and there were a lot of Arabs in the class. And I said to them, you tell me, where should Israel deploy? And I said, of course Israel should deploy in the Jordan Valley. And there's this, the logic is inexorable. Once you see the pictures, once you understand the topography, once you understand the geographical distances, the conclusion is inescapable. And so there you can see, this is where Palestinian state is supposed to be. The only barrier between the heavily populated coastal plain and the longest border that Israel has, which is the only place the Arabs can amass forces for a land-based attack along the narrow dimension of the country towards the heavily populated coastal plain. The only barrier is the highlands here, which are cut by a few roads, which can be shut off by small forces whilst the reserves are gearing for mobilization, etc., etc. So I'm just giving you in a nutshell why this territory is so important. There are various scenarios, each of which make the territory critically important, but I think, sort of in a nutshell, I think I've tried to convey to you how critical this is, and which is why this is impossible. By the way, the Jordan Valley issue, which was suggested, if Israel were just to hold the Jordan Valley, they had a narrow strip of troops with their back to the hills, hostile population behind them in the rear, and attacking forces in the front. It's not not a very reassuring position to be in, but again, I don't want to go into too much detail about it. Now, one of the least understood and perhaps most overlooked issues is the question of water, which, to tell the truth, has been somewhat less critical now because of desalination, but it's still an important issue for a number of reasons. If you look, these grey areas are areas of crucial hydrological importance for Israel. What does that mean? That means either drilling or pollution in these areas affect dramatically the water sources across the Green Line. So whether it's Palestinian sewage or Palestinian effluent from industry or Palestinian industrial, agricultural waste, etc., that all flows into Israeli water sources. If you don't control that, you can't control the pollution. Anyone drilling here can deplete the water sources this side of the Green Line as well. And so control of the highlands is crucial for controlling the mountain aquifer, which is perhaps the most important water source in Israel today. But again, that's just in a nutshell. We could expand, it's the whole lecture on the water issue, but this is something that people don't talk about much. And see, these are Palestinian wells. Unless you can control how much water these wells extract, you can't control the quality of the water in Israeli pumping fields. And this was a statement made by Uri Sagi, who was once head of military intelligence and later the chief executive of Mokorot, the Israeli water company. Says in any peace agreement, the Arabs were demanding 60% of Israel's natural water sources. So that's the significance of land for peace. So what does land for peace mean? It means all of the following are going to be in range of weapons that are already being used from territory handed over to Arab control. So this no longer can be dismissed as right-wing scaremongering. This is the empirical precedent which we have to contend with. First of all the major airfields, military and civilian, major seaports and naval bases, principal power stations, the Sweetwater system, crucial communication and transport system, think Kvish, think of the new railway, vital centers of military command and control, centers of civilian of government, and 80% of the population and 80% of military economic activity All of these will be in range of weapons being used today against Israel, and this would make the maintenance of any economic and social routine impossible. At least it will always be disrupted at the will of whoever is controlling the highlands. So territorial concession is a multi-dimensional threat in terms of length, the extent of the frontiers, width, no strategic depth, high topographical inferiority as you've seen, and depth hydrological dependency as you've seen as well. And so that is why we saw before Eugene Rostow told us that all the studies of the Israeli security problem reached the same conclusion. From the security point of view, Israel must hold the high points in the West Bank and the areas along the Jordan River. And that's when Bogi Yaron said demands for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank are irrational, which he said a few days ago. He was right. Fortunately, he never presents an alternative, but he's completely right. And so the retention of defensible borders by Israel implies the Palestinian state is untenable. And the establishment of a Palestinian state implies that Israel will have indefensible borders. And so that's the impasse. And there was a very astute analyst of Middle Eastern affairs who said in 1990, the structure of the bargain required to be struck between Israel and the Arabs seems inherently irresolvable. For whatever appears to be even minimally adequate for Israel seems to be totally inadequate for the Arabs. And so it was quite gratifying to see 10 years later, the head of the National Security Council said the maximum that the Israeli government will be ready to offer the Palestinians is much less than the minimum that any Palestinian leader can accept. And that's why the Palestinian state is impossible in terms of Israel's minimum security requirements. Okay, so now let's look at the Palestinian political competence. Now, I'm not sure this is a problem with the present audience, but what I'm going to say might sound a bit abrasive to some audiences, so I always put up a warning sign. The question why anyone who is advocating a Palestinian state must be forced to confront is the following. Why hasn't it happened up to now? Why hasn't there been a Palestinian state up to now? Okay, because if you look at the history of national freedom movements, the movement that had the least chance of success and achieved the most impressive accomplishments was the Jewish movement, the Jewish national movement, the Zionist movement. If you think what the point of departure was when Israel was established and what they've achieved up to now, and seem to be busy destroying, what they've achieved up to now is incredible. If you told anyone in the 1950s the depth of what was in the Tzena, the famine, that in a few decades there are going to be multi-lane highways and people traveling regularly abroad, and 2 cars, 3 cars to every family, etc., and a GDP per capita in line with the developed world, I would look to you, you're crazy. But that's what you've got, and everybody's worried that Zionism hasn't been a success. It's been a stunning success. But if the Zionist movement was the movement of national liberation that achieved the most impressive result, and started with the worst prospects, the movement that had the best prospects for success, and achieved the most miserable results are the Palestinians. Okay, the Palestinians' deeds and declarations raise doubts as to whether they really deserve a state, and I'll modify what I mean by deserve a state, whether they really desire a state. Now, when I say deserve, I'm not imposing my moral judgment on the Palestinians. I think that you can say with a great deal of justification that objectively the Palestinians have failed the test of history. Because that's the reason that they haven't set up the Palestinian state. Because even people like Severploska, who's hardly a hardline right-winger, says it should be said unabashedly, Had the Palestinians really wanted a state of their own, it would have been established long ago. The Palestinians prefer a state of no state, no responsibility, no commitments, and no solutions, with ongoing terror. If Yitzhak Rabin and Peretz had not dragged the Palestinian leadership to the Oslo Accords, it would have initiated anything by itself. And here you have a quote from a letter written by Lawrence of Arabia to the Times. He says the following: merit is no qualification for freedom. Freedom is enjoyed when you are so well armed, or so turbulent, or inhabit a country so thorny that the expense of your neighbors occupying you is greater than the profit. Okay? So, if the only criteria for independence is success, then surely failure indicates that there is no merit to your claim. And the Palestinians have failed time and time and time and time again. At some stage you have to say, they don't deserve it, they do not merit a state. So, do the Palestinians really deserve a state? Can we leave the questions for later? As I said, I think a strong case can be made for saying that they failed the test of history. Because the Palestinians have enjoyed almost universal international endorsement of their claims, highly supportive international media coverage, decades of superpower patronage. If you remember that when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, there were more officers of the PLO around the world than there were Israeli embassies. And enormous international financial aid, perhaps the highest per capita in the world. And most important, the highly accommodated Israeli regimes, which not only acknowledged their claims, but built their political platform on that acknowledgement. Like, for instance, the Labour Party in the 1990s. And despite that, all they've managed to achieve is a corrupt kleptocracy under Fatah. Something rotten in Palestine and Newsweek. Or a tyrannical theocracy under the Hamas, Gaza's deadly guardians, Times Online, none of which are really very pro-Israel. Or chronic chaos under both of them. So despite all these evident advantages, that's what they've achieved. And even Ephraim Halevi, former head of the Mossad, who's certainly not a hardline hawk, has said, I think peace between Israel and the Palestinians hinges on the Palestinians proving the capability of nationhood. A nation has to be built from within. The Palestinians are not creating their own nation because they're not really an authentic national entity. The Palestinian nation is being built with outside help. This, I think, cannot succeed. So, I think the strong case is here the Palestinians don't deserve a case, not as a value judgment, but as a conclusion that arises from seeing how they've contended with the test of history. Now, do the Palestinians really desire a state? There are two hypotheses. First of all, the first hypothesis is that the conflict is fueled by a lack of Palestinian self-determination, and what the Palestinians aspire to is to establish a state for themselves. But there's a competing hypothesis, that the conflict is fueled by the existence of Jewish self-determination, and what the Palestinians really aspire to is to destroy a state for others rather than establish a state for themselves. Now, which of these really has the most explanatory power? If we look at this well-known quote from Zaya Muhsin, which is often cited but never repudiated, okay? There are no differences between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. We're all part of one nation. It is only for political reasons that we carefully underline our Palestinian identity, because it is the interest of the Palestinian Arabs to encourage a separate Palestinian identity. The existence of a Palestinian separate identity serves only tactical purposes. The founding of a Palestinian state is a new tool in the continuing battle against Israel. Can't be clearer than that, why should Zaya Muhsin was formerly head of the PLO's military department, and he was head of the Asaka movement until he was dispatched to the next world by the Mossad. But it can't be clearer than that. Again, this should be on the front burner of Israeli public diplomacy. Now, I remember I once brought up this quote. There used to be an organization called the East-West Organization, which wanted to solve problems of the world. And once the Soviet and US clash died down, they were looking for other conflicts to solve, and they focused on the Israeli-Arab conflict. I was invited to a seminar, which was a closed seminar, a very small meeting, in a luxurious villa overlooking Sofia in the forest. And they brought some Palestinians there, they brought Mufal from the Democratic, I keep forgetting his name. I'll remember it later. And from one of Dakhlan's people, there were 3 or 4 Palestinians there. And I quoted the previous quote. I said, well, of course, he was a Syrian agent because he was head of SICA. But Farouk Kaddoumi can't be accused of being a Syrian agent. He has died in the wood Palestinians. And he said almost exactly the same thing in less words, exactly the same time. The Jordans and the Palestinians are considered by the PLO as one people. And even King Hussein said that the appearance of Palestinian national personality comes as an answer to Israel's claim that Palestine is Jewish, from which we must conclude that there was no claim that Palestine was Jewish, there'd be no Palestinians, right? And if you look at the Palestinian National Charter, they say that the Palestinian people are part of the Arab nation. But, notice, however, they must at the present stage of their struggle safeguard the Palestinian identity and develop the consciousness of that identity. Now, whatever the nation says, we must only stress at the present stage our identity. The Greeks, the Italians, Spanish, of course, it's all a giant hoax. That's the two-state solution. Once we've got rid of the Jews, then we'll join up with Jordan. And by the way, the Zayar book says that explicitly. So it's a giant hoax. And here, how many people understand Hebrew? You understand Hebrew? Put the tape on those. Let's, you know what, let's play the tape on.
מה? הוא מטור? אני לא חושב שיש אומה פלסטינית בכלל. אתה לא חושב שיש אומה? לא, אני חושב שיש אומה ערבית. אני תמיד חשבתי ככה, ואני גם לא שיניתי את דעתי. אני לא חושב שיש פלסטיניאן ניישן. אני חושב שזה המצאה קולוניאלית, פלסטיניאן ניישן. מתי היו פלסטינים? איפה זה? אני חושב שיש אומה ערבית. אני עוד לא הפכתי, למרות המאבקי הנחרץ בכיבוש, לא הפכתי ללאומן פלסטיני אף פעם. אני חושב שפלסטין עד לסוף המאה ה-19 הייתה דרום סוריה הגדולה.
So, there you have it. Okay. So there you have the English translation. Right? I don't think there's a Palestinian nation at all. I think there's an Arab nation. I don't think there's a Palestinian nation at all. I think there's an Arab nation. I always thought so and did not change my mind. I do not think there's a Palestinian nation. I think it's a colonialist invention, the Palestinian nation. Where were there any Palestinians? Where did they come from? I think there's an Arab nation. I think until the end of the 19th century, Palestine was the south of Greater Syria. And we should argue with him. Sorry? This was towards the end of the 90s. This was the program on Arutz Shtai.
Before he escaped. Before he escaped, yeah.
Yeah. But you could see there was Shlomo Ben Ami taking part, etc., in the debate. Again, Palestinians do not want to state. Researchers increasingly argue that Palestinians are uninterested in statehood. So there's so much material out there. It is a complete mystery why Israeli public diplomacy is so impotent and dysfunctional. So you have two hypotheses. Is the conflict fueled by the lack of Palestinian determination, and do the Palestinians really aspire to establish a state for themselves? Or is the conflict fueled by the existence of Jewish self-determination, and what the Palestinians aspire to is dismantle the state for others? Okay? And surely we should base our policy on the hypothesis that has the greatest explanatory power. And clearly the first hypothesis explains nothing, and the second hypothesis explains a great deal. Now, so what I've tried to do up to now is show you what's impossible in terms of Israeli security considerations, and what is impossible in terms of Palestinian aspirations and competence. They don't want a state. That's why they haven't managed to establish them. That's why even the most amenable conditions, it's failed time and time again. Okay, so if we can more or less reach an agreement that it's impossible in terms of security and impossible in terms of political competence, what's left, however improbable? So, what endeavors we've had? We've had limited autonomy hasn't worked, extended autonomy hasn't worked, negotiated sovereignty hasn't worked, unilateral withdrawal certainly hasn't worked. So what are the other solutions? If that's failed, that's failed, that's failed, and that's failed. Okay? What do we want from our solutions? Now, let's talk about the difference, first of all, between long-term strategic solutions and short-term tactical solutions. What do we want from a long-term strategic solution? Let's start off first with the tactical. The difference between the two, between strategy and tactics, is that tactics, you devise ways to contend with or manage undesirable resisting realities. With long-term strategic approach, you devise ways to aspire to or to attain desired and envisioned realities. So your strategy should be, so where do I want to go and how do I get there? Whereas tactics is, how do I manage my present problems? Okay? So what would be like from our desired strategic solution? First of all, we'd like to avoid long contorted borders. And this, in my opinion, is one of the major weaknesses of what Bennett is offering. Because if you look at this, the dark brown is area C. How are you going to annex that? If you annex that, how are you going to demarcate it and secure the borders? If you can't demarcate and secure the borders, what's the point? What's the significance of your sovereignty? I don't know, 3,000 kilometers of border that you have to demarcate and secure. How are you going to do that? Avoid inferiority and vulnerable topographical weakness, and avoid the presence of large, incompatible, and health potentially fractious socio-cultural ethnic groups, which in shorthand is Arabs. Okay? And that, in my opinion, is the weakness of Caroline Vick's suggestion. Because it's not just a matter of arithmetical majority. It's the size, it's the makeup of your socio-cultural population. And if you've got even a minority, but approaching 45% of Arabs, that's going to make the maintenance of the Jewish character of Israel impossible, especially now with what we're seeing with ISIS and the jihadi agitation. So, in reaching our strategic goal, Israel has to address two imperatives. And remember, as I said, my point of departure is that Israel has to remain the nation state of the Jewish people. The first imperative is the demographic imperative, and the second imperative is the geographic imperative. Now, in addressing these imperatives, we face two mortal dangers: the two-state solution and the one-state solution. The two-state solution doesn't address the geographic imperative, as we've seen, and the one-state solution doesn't address the demographic imperative. So we need to work out something else. And if we make a slight digression for a moment, and we look at the major challenge that Zionism has faced today, and we look at Persia and Palestine, what's the greater threat? Now, I agree, I don't want to belittle the Iranian threat, because I think that down the road, the Iranian nuclear program can endanger the physical survival of Israel. But the Palestinian issue can endanger the conceptual legitimacy of the Zionist concept. Now, because this is being used to delegitimize Israel, it's undermining our deterrence because we can't use the full force of our military powers because of political constraints. It's very divisive within Israeli society, and it's leading to the demonization of the army as well. So, let's see how successful this has been. If you run a Google search on the right of different countries to exist, okay, and you look at how many hits, the Google hits there are, it's probably changed, but it changes from time to time. But if you look how many articles there are dealing with Mexico's right to exist, Brazil's right to exist, Spain, Sweden, Tibet, Jordan, Georgia, perhaps because of Russia, Lebanon because of Syria. So these are the kind of hits you'll get if you run a Google, if you know the name of the country and its right to exist. If you run it on Israel, you get nearly 7 million.
One per person.
Huh?
One per person.
In other words, the discussion of Israel's right to exist is really a hot topic. And this is all because there's been no feasible solution suggested for the Palestinian issue. And so, to deal with this, what you have to do is delegitimize the Palestinian narrative. Because as long as the Palestinian narrative is considered legitimate, all the aspirations that flow from it will be considered legitimate. And anything that opposes it will be illegitimate. So if Israel's minimum security needs do not allow a Palestinian state, and a Palestinian state is legitimate, and Israel's legitimate security needs are illegitimate. And of course we could do that very easily if you wanted to, because all we have to do is quote Zaya Mukhsir, who says the existence of a Palestinian separate identity serves only tactical purposes. The founding of a Palestinian state is a new tool in the continuing battle against Israel. Why are we saying that? So, what we have to do is remove the issue of Palestinian statehood from the international agenda. Easier said than done. Easier said than done. But if Israel were to invest 1% of the state budget on public diplomacy pushing these ideas, that's $1 billion. With $1 billion, you can make a big impact. You can make a big impact persuading people. Today Israel spends less than what a medium to large size company spends on promoting fast foods and snacks. I'm not joking, that's literally. So if you're not investing in conveying your message, why would you expect it to be conveyed? Because once you delegitimize the Palestinian narrative, you delegitimize the fuel that drives the call for statehood.
So what are they supposed to do then with the Palestinian?
We're coming to that. Now, unfortunately, what's happened, you have Tzipi Livni in the government, and if you insist on portraying the Palestinians as lovable poodles when they're really vicious Rottweilers, no one understands why you need Rottweiler policy to deal with poodles. Right? So, the removal of Palestinian state from the international agenda, let's suppose we could do that, still doesn't deal with the humanitarian problem that the Palestinians have. And that's what has to be addressed. So what I'm going to suggest here towards the end of the lecture, I told you it was going to be a bit long, is a three-part proposal to deal with the problem, which is the following. First of all, to depoliticize the context. Atomize the implementation, and this obviates the need to reach an agreement with any Arab collective. Because no Arab collective is going to agree to Israel's minimum demands. Okay? What do I mean by depoliticize the situation? Instead of saying it's a political problem, no, it's a humanitarian problem. We're not the Palestinian political aspirations or a ruse, they're a hoax, we're not dealing with them. But we're prepared to deal on an individual basis with the humanitarian plight of the Palestinians. So we reformulate the Palestinian problem in humanitarian rather than political terms. Now, I think what I'm suggesting, I use the word libertarian in the European sense, sort of liberal not as opposed to conservative, but liberal as opposed to illiberal. Okay? First of all, we eliminate the discrimination in the treatment of Palestinians and facilitate the freedom of individual choice. What could be more politically correct than that? As far as the elimination of discrimination treatment of Palestinians, on two planes. First of all, as refugees, which means the elimination of UNRWA, and that's the thin edge of the wedge. And secondly, the elimination of ethnic discrimination of Palestinians in the Arab world. Now, if we look at UNRWA, you people, I suppose most people know the difference. Do people know about UNRWA? Okay, because if you don't agree with anything I've said up to now, and you don't agree with anything that I say after this, this is a standalone issue. Once you can deal with UNRWA, everything else will fall into place. Eliminating UNRWA will make my solution that I suggest inevitable anyway. All the refugees on the face of the globe are under the auspices of an organization called the UN High Commission for Refugees, except the Palestinians. The Palestinians have their own specific organization called UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. These two organizations have different definitions of who's a refugee and different mandates for dealing with them. According to the High Commission High Commission definition of who's a refugee, which is valid for all refugees, as I said, whether it's tsunamis, earthquakes, famine, political repression, the number of refugees decreases over time. According to the UNRWA definition, the number of refugees increases over time. According to the mandates of the High Commission, you can find permanent solutions for refugees in third-party countries, not necessarily their country of origin. According to the UNRWA definition, all you can do is take care of the humanitarian needs. So if you take the UNRWA definition, which defines an expanding population by definition, and the UNRWA mandate means all you can do is take care of the humanitarian needs and not find the permanent solutions, that means that UNRWA basically as an organization perpetuates the problem that it's supposed to solve. And unless you can deal with that problem, no solution, whether it's two-state solution, one-state solution, eight-state solution, no-state solution, nothing will work. Nothing will work because if you have the overhang of 5 million Palestinian refugees and growing, there is no way that you can solve the problem. So unless you can bring the treatment of Palestinian refugees into line with the accepted international law, no solution to this problem. And that's something that can be solved. In fact, it's becoming very bipartisan. It's becoming recognized. There are more and more articles that are appearing about the dysfunctional nature of UNRWA, written by people who are not right-wing at all. In fact, Scott Plasinski won the Yitzhak Rabin Shimon Peres Prize and said the current situation, particularly the delivery of international assistance to UNRWA, is untenable and does nothing to contribute to the eventual settlement. And Tom Lantis, who's no longer with us, but he was the senior Democrat in the House, said, frankly, I am baffled as to why more than 50 years after the founding of the State of Israel, there continues to exist a UN agency focused solely on the refugee problem. Why is an agency that was established on a temporary basis involved in an internal institution that is outside the administrative and policy jurisdiction of other UN voluntary organizations? No other refugee problem in the world has been treated in this privileged and prolonged manner. And Einat Wilf, who used to be in Ehud Barak's party, has also taken on this, and she's doing a lot of work on this. Recently, after many conversations that I've had with Shabtai Shabit, who's head of the Mossad, he delivered a lecture at the last counterterrorism conference, calling precisely for the dismantling of UNRWA and the resettlement of the refugees in Gaza outside the Gaza Strip, and wrote and published an article in Hebrew on this as well. I put it out on Facebook for the people who are my Facebook friends. You can get it off Facebook. And so, first of all, that's UNRWA. The first part, you have to get rid of UNRWA, and I believe that that can be done. Canada stopped funding UNRWA precisely because of the reasons we've been discussing here. The biggest obstacle to removing UNRWA is who?
The Israeli government.
The Israeli Foreign Ministry, yeah. I was once invited to give a lecture to a subcommittee of the the Knesset Defense and Foreign Policy Subcommittee. And I gave them the whole spiel. None of the members of the Knesset knew anything about it, by the way. Except the guy who invited me was Benny Elon. But none of them were all very surprised to hear this. But sitting opposite me were representatives of the Foreign Ministry who opposed and rejected everything I said. They said, UNRWA is not the enemy. But of course UNRWA is the enemy. It's against your national interest. Then the fact that there was a Swedish woman who was quite nice ahead of it means nothing. UNRWA is diametrically opposed to Israel's national interest, and it is an enemy. It's been completely overtaken by Hamas now as well. But let's suppose now you can fly this and all.
Who was the head of the foreign ministry at the time? Shimon Peres, maybe?
It's possible. But it doesn't make any difference. I mean, Lieberman's head of the foreign ministry now, but your diplomacy hasn't improved markedly anyway. But it's, and this is, if the Israeli government came with a resolute demand to the donor countries, none of whom are Arabs, by the way. None of them are Arabs. Maybe Saudi Arabia gives a few pennies, but the major donors are Europe, the United States, Japan. By the way, this came up for debate in the Japanese Parliament after a lecture I gave to one Japanese member of Parliament. He brought it up to the Parliament, but there's no follow-up. There's no follow-up from Israeli officialdom. Let's suppose that you can get rid of UNRWA. What do you do with the Palestinian diaspora in the Arab world who are no longer receiving their anomalous handouts? What you have to do, whether they do it or not doesn't matter, but Israeli foreign policy demand must be that they should be absorbed in the Arab host countries as citizens. Okay? Now, the biggest obstacle to this, of course, that the Arabs don't want to do this, but this must be exposed as blatant ethnic discrimination against the Palestinians. The spokesman of the Arab League, by the way, there's an Arab League resolution that forbids Arab countries to give citizenship to Palestinians. And he explains here, we know that the Palestinians live in very bad conditions. But the official policy. The official policy is meant to preserve the Palestinian identity. Okay? If every Palestinian who sought refuge in a certain country was integrated and accommodated into that country, there wouldn't be any reason for them to return to Palestine. Precisely. So that shows you that the people who are guarding Palestinian nationality more zealously are not the Palestinians, it's the other Arabs. Okay? And I'll go through this quickly, it was getting a bit late. Abu Mazen set off another bomb. In a television interview, he requested the Arab states grant citizenship to Palestinians living within their borders. Abu Mazen, right? Not Martin Sherman, the Super Hawk. Leading Arab television stations like Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera quickly conducted opinion polls in which more than 80% of the participants expressed the view that granting citizenship to refugees would ring the death knell for the right of return. Precisely. So the Arab population around objected to it, but however, when the two stations began interviewing Palestinians living in various Arab states, it soon became evident that the polls did not reflect the thinking of the Palestinian refugees, the vast majority of whom very much wanted to become citizens of the country of their residence. So that's why I'm offering a humanitarian solution. Offer them what they want. And you probably all heard of Khalil Shkaki, who ran a poll and had his office trashed because of the result of the poll. And because he said the refugees are human beings with needs, the people want to live their lives and they don't want to be national standard bearers anymore. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is basically just to comply with what the Palestinians and the diaspora want. No? That's the first two stages of what I'm suggesting. But the truth of the matter is I don't really care whether they get implemented or not. What I do care is that must be the position that the Israeli government holds. A, UNRWA must be dismantled, and B, once it's dismantled, the Palestinian diaspora must be offered citizenship in the Arab world. Even if you want for the transition period, you give the Arab host countries UNRWA's budget to help them absorb them. Okay? Now comes the real sharp end, the hot potato. Okay, offering individual Palestinians the freedom to decide their own fate. This now refers to the Arab population in Judea and Samaria and eventually in Gaza as well. Okay, you offer them generous family grants for relocation and rehabilitation and atomize the offer. What do I mean by that? That's not made to the collective. That's made to individual breadwinners, individual family heads. And let Faris and Ahmed and Mustafa and Mohammed say, no, I don't want the money. Okay? It mustn't be a political move. It's a humanitarian move. That's what I mean by atomizing implementation directly to family heads, not as a collective. Now, what would the choice be? They could continue the rigors of life under Israeli control, or they could live under the even more repressive and regressive Palestinian regime, or they could accept more money than they could ever dream of making and go away and build themselves a better life elsewhere. On the individual level, that's the rational solution. Now,
Who will take them in? Who will take them in?
who won't take them?
The other side of the bunch has got machine guns.
What do you mean? It's happening.
What?
Who will take them in?
Who won't take them in? Who won't take them in? But I'll come back to that in a second, okay? I'll address that issue. Okay, now, people say they won't accept this. Now, this survey is a little old, but it's the only survey that I've done, personally, okay? We did this with a very reputable Israeli company called Magal Mochot, who does all the polls for the TV stations here. And in collaboration with one of the prominent Palestinian opinion poll companies. And what we found is that only 15% said nothing would convince them to move. Over 70% said something which could be translated into money, whether it was better housing, better job, better employment, better education, etc. Said they would emigrate permanently. Now, if you see what's happening in Gaza, people are not being asked to pay. They're paying to get out of Gaza. And they're running the gauntlet. Recently, a boat was sunk and 500 people were drowned because people are fleeing Gaza. Okay, so just imagine if there was an organized effort to offer them large amounts of money, okay, say on an average, 1 million shekels per family, okay, what would happen? I'll come to it in a second, okay? But you must understand, first of all, in terms of scale and cost, the problem is trivial. It's a trivial problem in terms of scale and cost. There are, globally, 250 million migrants, most of whom are motivated by economic considerations. What would another 1% be? That's all you need, 1.5% of the Palestinians. Okay, if you were to move between 100 to 200,000 Palestinians a year, again, it will probably accelerate if it succeeds. The problem would be resolved within a decade and a half. And remember how long we've been trying to implement Oslo. Okay, Oslo has been on the table now for almost quarter of a century. And it's produced nothing but death and destruction. Okay, so at least as an option to be discussed and discussed vigorously and put on the table, this should be discussed. Rather than, for instance, annexing Area C, which would leave you with a crazy border of 3,000 kilometers. And what do you take the world about the 90% of the Palestinians who are going to be encapsulated in 40% of the territory, dislocated patches. What do you envision? Bennett's got this maze of interchanges and tunnels connected. Really, it's a solution totally detached from reality. And with all due respect to my colleague Carolyn, I think advocating a 45% Muslim majority starters is going to be catastrophic for Israel. Just think what will happen in terms of welfare budgets and road building and health control, etc., etc. It's an impossible solution. And people say, well, Jews will emigrate. No, Jews will emigrate, not immigrate. And you'll find instead of Israel becoming a more attractive place for Jews, will become a less attractive place for Jews. So the only non-coercive solution is to move the Arabs out of here. And the only non-coercive way to do that is by economic inducements. Sorry? Well, it just depends how you package it, though. You know, if you are packaging it having political correct wrapping.
How do you pull it off if they're going to be killed?
Sorry?
How do you pull it off if they're violently if they take the money? How do you pull that off?
You use your security services to protect them.
And if they don't have relatives...
Well, why don't we leave the comments and the questions for after?
So, as I say, if you look at the polls, there's a Palestinian organization called the Palestinian Research and Surveys, run by Shkaki, by the way. And regularly in Gaza, without any inducements he put on the table, between 40 and 45% today say they want to leave. They say they want to leave, no inducements on the table, and they have the courage to say that they want to leave. Now imagine if there was an organized offer to give them an opportunity to leave. And here's some old polls conducted by the people, opinion polls. 44%. This was conducted by where was this? It was Ahmed Jaffa. Yeah, at Bill Zayt University. 44% of the Palestinians are willing to immigrate if given the opportunity. Let's give them an opportunity. Among young men, it surges below 50%. Okay? The important thing to do, though, is to start setting up a cogent alternative to the two-state solution or the one-state solution of all the citizens. And that's why it's urgent to start promoting this. Now, of course, it has impeccable humanitarian criteria. Here you have a quote from Herbert Hoover, who was dubbed the great humanitarian for his humanitarian activities against starvation in Europe. And he said the consideration should be given even to the heroic remedy of transfer of populations. The hardship of moving is great, but it is less than the constant suffering of minorities and the constant recurrence of war. Who disagrees with that? And Sakharov, with all the money that has been invested in the problem of the Palestinians, it would be possible long ago to resettle them and provide them with good lives in Arab countries. So you've got impeccable libertarian and humanitarian credentials. The collapse of the Oslo process and ever-worsening Israeli-Palestinian violence demonstrates certain long-held truths about the conflict need to be turned on their heads. The US should launch an international initiative and provide economic support for refugees in neighboring states, including host governments, and provide incentive packages for repatriation to non-neighboring states, including the West. Okay? He is a recipient of the Yitzhak Rabin Shimon Peres Peace Award from Tel Aviv University. And even Yossi Beilin said, the EU should absorb Palestinian refugees. So we agree on the principle, we might disagree on the scope. So let's talk about the cost for a minute. Now, in many ways, the absolute cost is irrelevant, because the alternatives are not free either. Setting up a Palestinian state, building its infrastructure, which will probably fail anyways, is billions of dollars. So you can't just dismiss this proposal on the basis of absolute cost, you have to compare it to the other costs. And remember, the proponents of a two-state solution talk about repatriating the Palestinian diaspora back in the Palestinian state. Quite apart from the fact that what this would mean if you brought a few million Palestinians and put them on the doorstep of Petah means, quite apart from that, why would moving many Palestinians from there to here be more affordable than moving a few Palestinians from here to there? Okay, so the absolute cost must always be compared to the alternative. Now, it's a fraction of what the Americans paid for their war on terror. If you look at this graph, Americans spent about $1 trillion on the war in Iraq. Now, when did they spend it? You can see this is when Saddam Hussein was captured. 90% of that $1 trillion was spent trying to build democracy in Iraq. What are these guys smoking? You know, and in Afghanistan, Afghanistan was the same thing. Democracy on the slopes of the Tora Bora, really? So the money's available. The money's peanut money. If Israel today has a GDP of $250 billion, if it were to allot something like 7%, which is a lot of money, 7% of its GDP, to resetting Palestinians elsewhere, it could solve the problem within 2 decades. If you could gain legitimacy for the proposal and get the developed countries to contribute a fraction of a percent of their GDP, you could do everything within a decade. The money is not the problem, it's the political will, and the political will is the function of retaining the political legitimacy for it. Okay, and as I said, the scale is nothing. For instance, you ask where they'd go. Let's suppose that all the Palestinians decided they wanted to go to Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, and Indonesia opened their gates to the Palestinians. What would be the result of this? It would mean each Palestinian breadwinner would be arriving at the gates of Indonesia with something like 7 decades of GDP in Indonesian terms in his pockets, the equivalent to someone arriving in America with $2 to $3 million. Okay? It would also mean that Indonesia would get an influx of hundreds of billions of dollars depending on the level of compensation. So for Indonesia to accept, they're not accepting destitute refugees, they're accepting relatively wealthy newcomers. That's the incentive for the other side to it. And because it's not a political en masse movement, because it's a gradual osmotic motion, that's why it wouldn't be traumatic for them. It would be an increase of 1%, of less than 1% of the Indonesian population. Why wouldn't they exactly take that if they came along with billions of dollars into the economy? Now, obviously, Indonesia won't take them all, but Kenya might take some. I'll give you an example. I was once invited by the INSS. The only time I've ever been invited to do anything at the INSS was because I was the first Israeli who started talking about the strategic ascent of India. And they brought over the Indian branch of the Aspen Club. And they had a speech, and they asked me to talk about Indian-Israeli relations. And after we went for dinner, and I sat next to this Indian MP, and we talked about the Palestinian problem, and I gave him this idea. He said, "That sounds very reasonable, very logical. Tell me, how many Palestinians are there?" And I said, "No, it depends who you ask. There's a big argument. No one thinks there are more than 5 million Palestinians." So he says, "Is that all? We could take them." It's true. It's really, well, once you get used to the idea, the scale is insignificant. It's an insignificant problem in terms of scale, and it's an insignificant problem in terms of money if there's political will and political legitimacy for it. As I say, I estimate you could probably solve the problem, depending on how many Palestinians you think there are. I reckon something like $200 billion would solve the problem, which is less than 10% of, which would be, if it's spread over 15 years, it's less than 10% of Israel's GDP, if it were to shoulder the burden alone. So, if you look at the proposed solution, well, I think this is a win-win situation, because it will alleviate, even eliminate humanitarian plight of individual Palestinians, ensure the continued security and survival of Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people, provide a significant boost to the economics of the developing world, who will be the host countries, and transform poverty-stricken refugees into affluent immigrants. So, why wouldn't they accept that? Now, to feasibility, and if we talk about feasibility, territorial compromise has been tried time and time again, and failed continually. So we know that Einstein said insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And George Santayana says fanaticism is redoubling your efforts when you've forgotten the objective. So you need to decide whether territorial compromise is either fanatical insanity or insane fanaticism. But if you compare that with relocation and rehabilitation, which would make the individual recipients far better off, the host countries far better off, at an acceptable economic cost, at least as an alternative to be seriously discussed, that should be on the table, and you people should be pushing it with everyone you talk to. So, just going back for a second, Palestinian lies, remember Amnon Rubinstein? Of all the Palestinian lies, there is no greater lie or more crushing than that which calls for the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank. Not since the time of Dr. Goebbels, the head of the Nazi propaganda machine, has there ever been a case in which a continued repetition of a lie has borne such great fruits. Okay, that was Amnon Rubinstein, Palestinian lies, Minister of Education, Israel Prize winner. And no one is asking him to account for this. No one wonders when the great metamorphosis occurred that transformed this crushing lie into a guiding light for Israeli policy. And perhaps the only non-academic or element in the whole presentation is this poem. Written by Atman, my translation. Then Satan said unto himself, this besieged foe, how is to be overcome? Both courage and skill are his. He is well armed and well alert. Then Satan said, not his strength shall I sap, nor bridle and muzzle shall I place on him, nor fear shall I bring into his heart, nor cause him to be weak as he once was. All I shall do is this, his mind I shall dull, and make him forget that righteousness is with him. And that's the problem, we've forgotten that we're the good guys. Okay? And this would probably be a good place to stop, but we still owe Sherlock Holmes a small debt. Remember, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains ever improbable must be the truth. And funded immigration is the truth. Okay, because remember we've had limited autonomy and that failed, and extended autonomy that failed, negotiated sovereignty failed, unilateral withdrawal failed. So we must be left with some other alternative. So what would Sherlock Holmes say about reframing the Palestinian problem in humanitarian rather than political terms? Well, I think we all know what he would say. Elementary, my dear Watson.
I'm sure that there's a lot of people who've got questions. What we'll do is to save you all from raising your hands each and every time. Let's say the lady there, and the gentleman there, and there was a gentleman, this lady here. So we'll have, yes. After these three people have asked their questions and Martin has answered, then we'll go to the next trio. Yes?
It's hard for me to say after such a presentation, so many facts and so many figures, that something is missing. Forgive me, but why are we not demanding compensation for continuous aggression and for the fact that we won every war of aggression and that no nation in the world has returned to an aggressor what was lost in a war of aggression? Why don't we talk about ethnic cleaning? It's a very popular expression these days. There was ethnic cleaning in the Arab countries of all the Jews from Arab countries, and they're now more than half of our population. We see today what's happening in the Arab countries with minorities. It's time to go out and show that the problem is not Israel. The problem is with Islam, and this is an Islamic problem, and it's in the heart of Islam. Anybody who knows even the elementary code of Ummah knows that Islam cannot tolerate minorities, cannot tolerate any other people. And we've been going on the wrong track all the time. Yours is one track, I agree with it. But why don't we go on become more aggressive?
That's in my opinion, a good point, a different lecture. Because I think you put your finger on an important point, which I alluded to earlier, is that Israel's public diplomacy, Israel would call Hasbara, is totally dysfunctional. And the reason for that is that in the fight for public opinion, Israel doesn't want to win. Because our public diplomacy is controlled by an elite that identifies more with the Palestinian narrative than it does with the Zionist narrative. And unless you can address that, which is one of the major efforts that I'm trying to do with my institute, unless you can deal with that, the problem that you correctly raised will not be contended with sufficiently. As I said before, why isn't the Israeli government showing all the things that I've said here? Why isn't the Israeli right wing? Where's the Likud? Who is Bennett? Why isn't this on everybody's mind? And unfortunately, you have in Israel much the same syndrome that you have in America. You have an incompetent right wing and a delusional left wing. And because the right wing is incompetent, it can't prevent the delusions of the left, and that's why. I mean, if you think of it, it's almost incredible that the left wing has any credibility left in the Israeli public, because everything that they've promised hasn't come about. Everything that we warned about if we adopted their policy has come about, and yet they're still a political force and they control much of what goes on in public life in Israel. So unless you can address the problem that I'm talking about, the problem that you're talking about won't be addressed. Hang on, there was someone else. Where's Ralph? You were dishing out the question.
I'm sorry. I certainly needed this. Yeah. We're doing threes, we're doing trios. So there was a gentleman there.
Which one?
The one at the back.
It's not a nationalistic solution to delegitimize Palestinians. We must take back the Temple Mount and rebuild our great Mikdash.
Amen.
And make this Muslim something larger.
I do want to ask you, please, try and frame questions. And also regarding what Martin's been saying. Okay, we have a lady there, yes.
Hopefully people will hear me because it's related to this thing that I quoted actually to.
Maybe the microphone.
Easier because I don't have a loud voice. In 1922, this was expressed that the Arabs shall be permitted. Hold on one second. That the Arabs shall be permitted to remain in Palestine under Jewish governance and dominion, and with their civil and religious right guaranteed to them through the British mandate and under terms of Balfour Declaration. That if they will not consent to Jewish governance and dominion, they shall be required to sell their lands at the just valuation and retire into the Arab territories which has been assigned to them by the League of Nations in the general reconstruction of the countries of the East. 3, that they will not consent to the Jewish government and dominion under the conditions of right and justice, or to sell their lands at the just valuation to retire into their own countries. They shall be driven from Palestine by force. This actually was written by Representative Walter Chandler from from New York in response to the idea of having, a state, a Jewish home. So my question is, there is an alternative. There is an alternative that is not being looked at. Is our just cause? You're saying that you want to give them a humanitarian solution, but there is another one. We were given by law, this country, okay, by the League of Nations, by 4 consecutive presidents, and by the UN, okay, that basically said that this is our borders, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. What I don't understand is there is an alternative of having that as the major story behind our work. And we shouldn't really think about the humanitarian side before we think of a just way to solve the problem as a general plan, okay? And there is other options. So.
Yes,
Well, it's a very interesting quote, actually. I'd like you to send it to me. But I've got no argument with you. My argument is not with you. The question is, how do you transform our aspirations into an actionable plan? And it's easy to convince me that we should try coercive solutions, but then you must understand that coercive solutions come with consequences. I think you'd be in a much stronger position. Eventually, as people say, well, what happens if it doesn't work? Okay, you can say, but you can answer that for any question. For instance, if you're a two-state proponent, and they say, we want a two-state solution. What happens if a two-state solution doesn't work? Okay, suppose you set up a Palestinian state, and it gets taken over by a jihadi group, or by ISIS. What do you do? Okay, so the answer is, okay, you're left with coercive options. But when do you want to start? If I'm arguing with a two-state solution guy now, when do you want to start your coercive options? Before you've made perilous concessions, or after that? Because even in my solution, you might be eventually forced to use coercive solutions which involve moving populations. But when do you want to start that? Internationally, when do you want to start your coercive initiative? After you've offered them a reasonable, non-coercive solution, or before? Okay, so I'm not saying that there shouldn't be coercive solutions if there's no option. The question is, how do you want to arrive at the state when you institute those coercive solutions? Before you've offered them a diplomatically acceptable alternative, or afterwards? I can see my prognosis of what's going to happen here is very dire. I think unless we adopt a very strong iron fist in our attitude of the Palestinians, you're going to find insurrection by Israeli Arabs. And then what do you do? It's true. But because the more weakness you show, the more leniency you show, the bolder the other side gets. In my opinion, we're going towards a very dangerous situation for the Israeli Arabs as well. And the question is, what do you need to institute that coercive solution?
There's no need for coercion, by the way. There's other solutions, like administrative areas that will be instituted and will be not considered any autonomy. You can do something like they have in Puerto Rico, which is giving them a non-citizen status.
Yeah, but with all due respect, there's no way. There's no way that you can maintain the Jewish character of the state if you use it.
In Puerto Rico, they can't.
But Puerto Ricans are not Islamists.
But I'm saying, what you have is basically you have a group of people, they're already here, but you're not giving them citizenship, you're giving them being able resident aliens.
Well, you've convinced me. All you have to do is convince them now. Because I don't
need to. I'm coming from a different point of view.
But how are you going to impose that solution if they don't want to? Only coercive.
No, because I'm coming and I'm the sovereign here. I am the sovereign with the rights to be here.
I'm not arguing with that. But how does that? What is that in operation?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm really sorry, but a whole lot of people want to ask questions, and it's, okay, let's take some, how do you choose? There's a dozen people who want to ask questions. Okay, yes, you'll be first, and you will be, oh, I like green shirts. Green fella, yes, yeah, you need to. I'm going to take you because you pointed to the other guy. Oh, you want the other guy? Okay, so that's it. So you, please, and the green shirt, and the other guy. Okay.
In order for your program to work, or any positive program, in order for your program to work, for any positive, effective program to work, don't you think that it has to be prefaced by an intensive PR program by the government explaining our legal rights to the land? Legal rights, which we have full, every person who has an understanding, a true understanding of the legal and international law, knows that we have better rights than anyone else, and the government is not saying a single word.
The short answer to that is yes. I agree with you. Our legal rights, our moral rights, and historical rights, etc., etc. But that won't happen. The government's not going to do that unless there is massive public pressure on the government to do so. You must understand, in Israel there are no leaders, only maybe representatives. Okay, and there are very few politicians who adopt policy on the basis of the substantive merits of the policy. Their main goal is how to stay in power. And unless you can create constraints, that means if they don't do what you say, they won't stay in power, they won't do it. And so what you're suggesting, yes, I agree with you, 100%. And I've spoken to government ministers at the highest level on this, but they don't do it. It's a joke. For Israel to launch the kind of offensive, public diplomacy offensive they're talking about, it's peanut money. It's $1 billion is 1% of the state budget. If every single other item was cut by 1%, you would have $1 billion to spend on the kind of things you're talking about. But they're not doing it. So, because there's no political will, and because, in my opinion, the Israeli public is too docile.
Following you on a lot of things, it's sort of like summarized it very nicely, and I agree with it. What I always wonder about, though, is how do you create the incentive for the political scheme or strategy for getting the political will to actually implement this? Because as much as it makes sense, it seems like it's in the present political will, it seems far-fetched. And I know it's not far-fetched, but I'm just saying, how do you create the political will even if it's a good idea?
Well, let me say the problem, basically, the problem is with right-wing benefactors and how they use their money. Before you reach the political issue, if you look at the way that left-wing benefactors give their money and right-wing benefactors give their money, you'll see that left-wing benefactors in many ways give their money for frameworks that advance agendas, whether it's J Street or the New Israel Fund or Peace Now. They have very effective means of advancing their agenda. Right-wing benefactors normally give for things, whether it's real estate or ambulances or buildings, etc., etc. And this is all very noble, but it's not going to win the battle. I remember I had a conversation with Sherman once. She was buying a lot of property in East Jerusalem. And I said, it doesn't matter how much property you buy for Jews. If there's a decision to divide the capital, it doesn't matter who's got legal title to the house. The next regime will either let them keep their property or confiscate it. And unless right-wing benefactors, and maybe I'm giving myself a personal push here, that's the kind of thing. To do exactly what you want to do is to motivate the political echelons. You need organizations like mine. Because you've got, for instance, the left wing, you've got INSS, funded by Frank Lowy, an Australian billionaire. They can have international conferences and write position papers and get on TV and international media, etc., etc. They've got $1 million budget. There's no counter on the right wing, and unless the right wing starts building that kind of intellectual infrastructure, they're not going to mobilize the politicians, because the politicians here live in a bubble created by Aretz, CNN, and the New York Times. They think that's.
What do you recommend to the little guy out there that agree with you, because don't feel helpless in terms of like going about actually doing something about it, who don't necessarily have billions of dollars to contribute to organizations, even like yours or whatever, or creating new ones? I mean, how do we?
You know, first of all, on a personal level, you can make a nuisance of yourself with your political representative and create. That's one thing. But what you need to do is find groundswell to build an intellectual infrastructure that can set the agenda. Because what's what the left did, by the way. Oslo wasn't born in the political system. I remember driving in 1990, just before the election, 1988. Just before the Oslo Agreement, I was driving my car down the seafront in Tel Aviv, and there was a program on the Labour Party and what they were going to put in their platform. And the left wing of the Labour Party suggested supporting a Palestinian state. And Shimon Peres went ballistic. He said, "Are you guys crazy? Only 2% of the population will support it." And if you were a Palestinian in 1968, imagine how hopeless things must have looked. Imagine how hopeless things must have looked. Yeah. But because they were resolute, because they were resourceful, and because they found the resources, they managed to take a position that was completely off the screen.
We have to use the same tactics of Palestine.
Exactly. What the left wing did, the same thing. The left wing took a position. The left wing took a position that was completely marginal. There was no delegitimate. It was illegal. If you went around the country trying to advocate what the Likud has adopted today as their platform, you'd put in jail for treason. Literally, you'd be put in jail for treason. And so what the left wing has done is taken a position like that, and because they were resolute, because they were resourceful, and because they had resources, they managed to take it and change it to mainstream. And that's what the right wing has to do. But it has to change the objective.
We've got time for just two more questions. I think you had one and one more. The lady over there.
Sherman, I just want to make one or two comments before I go louder, before I can pose my question. One of the points you made was about what do the Palestinians do? They want a state, or do they want to destroy the state? So I don't know, I hear your South African accent, and therefore you should know it's probably very similar to the blacks in South Africa, which is only coming out now after 20 years of democracy, where you get a guy like Malema, who's the third alternative. It's not they want to destroy, not that they want their own, but they want yours. And that's the position in Israel, my opinion. They want your state.
So what is your question?
The further to that is all politically, scientifically, whatever you say, I can agree with 100%. But we're missing out on the one aspect, and that is the axiom of history. Esav sonei et Yaakov. And because we don't see it, we're blind, because you see Jonathan Pollard languishing in prison, in the greatest supporter of Israel's in the United States. So my question is really more of a comment that we've got to consider. So my question is it's only partial. The scientific explanation of the situation is only partial, because we're not dealing with that aspect,
I agree with
which is the main aspect. And about Bennett and about Bibi Netanyahu, they see the picture, but they're playing the game. Because in this world, you can only play a game because they're aware of, and you hear it in their words, of Esav Sonei Yaakov, anti-Semitism. And without talking about anti-Semitism, we can't deal with the situation realistically.
Thank you. Would you like to take let's try and make it a question.
Oh, I.
Please. You have to come in, please. This is as far as here.
Hi. We all should have given our names. I'm Gail Winston. And anyone who wants that map of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, please give me your email address and I'll send it to you if I can. Because I brought that map here. My question is, can we take an idea and mobilize the people to support the idea as a groundswell, something that is beginning but hasn't yet happened? And I'm talking about demanding our sovereignty. If we can demand our sovereignty, can we do this? Can we do it loud enough? Are all of us rich enough to be able to demand our sovereignty? If we can demand our sovereignty, then we can offer a solution like Martin is suggesting. Then it becomes possible. But if we don't have something that we can all support, which I think we would support sovereignty, plain and simple, sovereignty. If that word becomes the groundswell, the bandwagon, the thing we can get on top of, then we have a chance to be able to offer. That amount of money sounds horrific, but that's at the end. That's not at the end, that's in the middle. That's after we all agree that we're going to support sovereignty. Can we do sovereignty? Can we make that our groundswell? One simple word. Israeli sovereignty over the whole land. Not little pieces, but the whole land, river to the sea.
I certainly agree with sovereignty from the river to the sea. I just think that you have to be ready with the question, the answer to the question that the demand is inevitably going to raise. So what about the non-Jews? And what I'm trying to do is prepare an answer for what to do with the non-Jews once you raise the sovereignty. I'm obviously a committed advocate for extending sovereignty from the river to the sea. But to make that an operational policy, you need to be ready with answers. So what about the Arabs? Because Carolina gives an answer. Carolina gives them a path to permanent citizenship and sovereignty. I think that's disastrous. I think Bennett, for instance, doesn't want to do. So I agree, sovereignty from the land and the sea, but you need to have a response to people who are going to ask you, what about the non-Jews?
And the bottom line is, you need to support our institute so that we can do what we have to do. Lots of programs that we want to go to.